Gentlemen, welcome back to another video podcast on moments that matter in the employee journey. As we continue to better understand that story, that's title, we need to better understand the subtopics as we have seen in the previous podcast episode. So today, we're going to be digging a bit deeper into the actual employee engagement part. And I am so thrilled to finally say a big thank you to our very first US guest, Ailin. Thank you so very much for joining us on this video podcast. Paul as well, colleague and friend, thank you for joining. Maybe just to start off, Ailin, why don't you introduce yourself, your company? We're thrilled to hear all of this.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you so much, Paul and Blake, for having me. Super excited to be here. And then, like you mentioned, my name's Ailin. I started off my career in HR right after college and kind of gradually shifted to employee experience. Currently, I work for Xevant, which is a PBM analytics company based off in Lehigh, Utah. And then my role right now, what consists of, kind of switching from HR to that employee experience is a lot of emphasis on onboarding. So, being that first touch point for employees so right after, recruiting, what's the next step? So that's kind of where I jump in for a lot of our employees. And then kind of phasing out of the onboarding experience, going on to retention. So recognition, surveys / feedback, career development, state interviews, and then just kind of up until their tenure.
Interesting. And with all these different experiences that you have had, and now that you're working in the tech industry with Xevant, do you find that employee engagement is something more important? Because don't get me wrong, of course, employee engagement is important for all industry, but how do you feel it stands within the tech industry?
Yeah, I feel like with the tech industry, specifically, it's not that it's more important than other industries, but I think because now, as we've seen a little bit more popular right after COVID, the tech industry has a lot of more remote jobs, right? Some hybrid and stuff like that. So I think kind of creating that employee experience kind of shifted a little bit from having to be, only in person, right? So previously, you show up to your job on the first day at the office. Now we're seeing that employee experience is you never meet them in person, right? It's all done remotely. So I think having to shift that point of view of being like a physical employee experience to a remote or a virtual employee experience, and just making sure you don't miss those key points and make sure employees still feel that, that big welcome. I think that's kind of like a huge shift for the tech industry.
Interesting. Paul,
definitely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you mentioned quite a few great things. Milestones are a huge part of the employee experience. How may different types of companies, maybe even outside of the tech industry, how do you think they can engage and keep their I guess employees retention or engagement in that sense in check, whether they're remote or hybrid? What would be like kind of like some best practices that you've seen in your space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like you said, whether they're in tech or not, industry, I think, like you mentioned, getting those touch points, something that, we like to focus on is our years of service. And, I think depending on the company, big or small, sometimes you may not have the budget to do something huge and elaborate, but I think still getting, something as a simple message or just having that personal relationship with your employees where they feel seen, they feel heard and acknowledged. I think that goes a long ways of like, happy anniversary, here's an iPad, things like that, where it's just a little bit more personal, and kind of, staying on that personal touch. Something that I think is a really good thing to incorporate in a lot of companies is state interviews, or we call them here at Xevant employee engagement interviews, where you ask them, hey, like, what can we do better for you? How are you liking our benefits? What benefits would you like to see? So I think that what we've seen recently in trends is that employees care about that a little bit more, as in like, oh, they care about my well-being versus like, a flashy gift or something like that, if that makes sense.
Sure. Absolutely. And one thing I really like as well is the fact that when it comes to the survey and also the benefit of the employees, they've always been there. It's not like they suddenly appeared out of the blue, but it is so much more discussed today, as you mentioned, after COVID with the current geopolitical situation. 2024, come on, good year for us.
Yeah.
But my point being out of this, How do you see the surveys have evolved, for instance, since you were mentioning asking the employees how they feel about the latest benefits and so on. So I'm assuming, but do correct me if I'm wrong, that you're utilizing surveys to better identify those things. And how do you feel they've evolved since pre-COVID and now, and why they are, well, are they more important to your perspective, or do you find them less important?
That's a good question. I think before, and again, I'm maybe overgeneralizing, or this is just my point of view, but I think before surveys were used more as of a let's collect the information, and then once you collect it, it's like, okay, good to know. Let's do this again next year, right? But I think now it's, hey, let's understand if our employees are happy or not. Let's kind of understand the why behind the answers. And I think now, again, depending on the company, it's you want to kind of give back to your employees. So if they're not happy with XYZ, okay, let's find out how we can do better. And then, kind of give out that announcement. Hey, employees, based off your feedback, this is what we did, or this is what we changed. So I think before it was more of a kind of one-sided, or just getting information from one end. But I think now it's, kind of both ways, and kind of creating that relationship where, hey, we heard you, now here's your results, or here are some answers, or here's a change, for example.
And so you would say that right now in your company, it's a more continuous approach when it comes to surveys?
Correct, yes.
Okay, so it's continuous approach, then the feedback, and then what was the last part? The reward, I believe, the actual action behind it. And yeah, I like that as well, because it shows as well the employees. Like I find that really interesting, because like it's true. Me and Paul have the chance of speaking with the people from different industries, and often you find out, the once a year survey, that's one thing. And sometimes you also find out that people don't necessarily want to answer them, because they also don't see that last part that you mentioned, is actually seeing what the outcome is from having been heard in the first place.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of like the bigger shift right now. And again, tech industry or not, but I think employers really need to kind of realize the importance of giving back that answer, or that voice, I guess.
Yeah, you mentioned like a lot of emphasis on different types of industries as well. As we feel like there is some symptoms of, let's say, an economic downturn, to what extent is doing something like this still relevantly important? Because some companies may feel like, like you mentioned, budget, right? That's a huge component of doing something like this. However, there is that part where, does it cost more also to retain and to lose an employee as well? So I feel like there's companies like have to have that balancing act. So in that sense, to what extent is that kind of like, where does that importance lie in terms of like making this kind of like really happen and be the culture for any type of company or in any type of industry?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I feel like it's almost like more important when, like you said, budgets are tight, there is an economic downturn. And I feel like when that happens in a company's, employees may get a little bit scared, right? Like, oh no, like are layoffs coming, or is my salary being reduced? So I think there sometimes can create a little bit more tension, a little bit more, of a scared feeling between employees. So I feel like that's where it's like 100% crucial to let your employees know, hey, we hear you, we hear you're stressed, you're scared, hey, I am too, like, let's work through this together. Although perhaps we may not increase our benefits right now, let's do this, or kind of just finding an alternative, because there are things in a company's culture and the employee experience that don't really cost anything, right? It's that message from leadership, it's that message from your manager, and that reassurance, pardon me, that again, it doesn't cost anything. So I think it's almost a little bit more important when there is that economic downturn to kind of care for your employees.
Yeah, and I feel like that's the case where people are, or some leaders may feel like, oh, it has to be in an intrinsic value kind of way, when it doesn't really have to be. So okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, there's just so much information, because even we're talking about the feedback, which itself is a subject of itself and has evolved so much with time, including the survey. And it's fantastic to hear that finally, surveys are slowly being looked with a different eye, and we're reevaluating them, but also how we're attributing the budget, the finance, because yeah, as Paul mentioned, it's not the easiest moment, but what's the most important thing in the company is the people of that business. I was actually recently watching this TED talk where the person is an ex-CEO, and he said, the company is like a shoebox, but without the people, well, it's just an empty shoebox, right? So I really like that metaphor, and therefore it's really valuable to be able to identify and analyze those different things as well. I'm curious just to know, if you don't mind me asking, from your company perspective as well. Is there any particular new strategies that you guys have recently implemented when it comes to the call to action from those results of those surveys? Any tips and tricks that you're willing to share with the audience, since we have all around industries that are also listening and tuning in. So if there's anything you can share, that'd be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think. Trying to remember from our last survey that we did, I think a lot of it was, some feedback was on the benefits and, employees' opinions or feedback on the benefits. And again, sometimes you come to a point where a company can, do XYZ that employees are requesting, or companies can't do XYZ. But I think either or is just always being transparent. So I think something that we do a really good job at is saying, hey, employees, we heard your feedback on benefits. And for example, although we weren't able to do this, we were able to do this, or we got this instead of that. So I think just always communicating, again, whether it was done or it was able to be done or not, just communicating, hey, we were able to do it, or hey, we weren't able to do it, and this is why. I think that will always go a long ways with employees, and just help them be understanding instead of, having that eye roll and be like, oh, they never listen, like always, So I think just that communication, that transparency I think it's crucial.
Beautiful. Well, as we come to the last couple of minutes, Paul, maybe one last short question you'd like to ask?
Yes, definitely. So I've been seeing a lot of, I've been hearing a lot of murmurs also. In some way, competency mapping or skills mapping has become relevantly a priority for HR leaders. How do you feel about, making sure that employees are getting that chance to have their competency even looked at, and making sure they achieve whatever they feel like they can, let's say, apply for a role or position in the future? How has that been, kind of like popping up in your radar, and how have you been kind of just, solving for it, or making plans around, competency mapping, making sure that those employees progress in their career?
That's a good question. And I feel like at Xevant, we've always had that, competency planning from the leader's perspective, right? Analyzing employees, doing talent reviews, kind of forecasting that plan. But then I feel that, something that employees need and want is for them to see that, right? Like your manager
Sure.
can be talking about your development to their leaders and saying, hey, you're going to excel. But if the employee doesn't know that, or they're not aware of that, they'll just, they'll never kind of feel it or feel the importance. So something that we have recently implemented, and it's in the process of being rolled out. So if some of our employees hear this before, they may be like, we don't have that yet, but it's being rolled out. But something that we're implementing is career tracks. So kind of having levels and saying, hey, you're a developer, you're a, senior, or you're an expert. And it's not really of labeling employees and putting them in a box or in a level per se, but it's identifying what skills they have from each level, if that makes sense. So you could be a, director of people operations, but still have some developing skills and some expert skills. So kind of seeing where you can grow within the career track, but then also, when you mentioned, kind of being promoted or even applying to a different job within your company, is making the other career tracks available to employees. Let's say your director of people ops wants to go into SDR, they can see that career track and what they need to do to get to that position. So I think just, again, all about transparency, letting employees see the different fields or different career tracks in your company will kind of help them get there.
Nice. Perfect.
Guys, so sorry to cut you both. Don't get me wrong, amazing conversation. And to our audience, we will be on Spotify eventually. We will be on YouTube, and I promise you, we will let our guests such as her speak for more than 50 minutes. But for this one, we're going to stuck to this one. Firstly, thank you very much, Ailin, for sharing your opinion, your feedback in regards to this
Thank you
topic.
very
It was
much.
really interesting. Yeah, really, really interesting. And to our audience, hope you enjoyed it as much. We would like to as well thank our partner, Luta One. Stay tuned in. Have a great day ahead, guys. Cheers.